November 23, 1944. Camp Lordsburg, New Mexico. Kimiko Tanaka stood at the threshold of the mess hall, her breath catching in the dry desert air. Before her stretched tables covered in white cloth, not canvas, not tin, but cloth. Steam rose from platters of roasted turkey, golden and glistening under the harsh light bulbs. The scent of sage and cinnamon hung thick, impossible, wrong. Her daughters gripped her hands tighter. Behind them, 43 other Japanese women prisoners shuffled forward, eyes wide, mouths silent. They had expected punishment. They had prepared themselves for humiliation. What they found instead would shatter every assumption they carried across the Pacific about their captors, about this war, about what it meant to be an enemy of America. Before you hear how this impossible scene unfolded in the high desert of New Mexico, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. Whether you're in Manila or Montana, Osaka or Ohio, we're building a community dedicated to preserving these forgotten stories, the moments that reveal war's deepest contradictions, the humanity that survived even total conflict. The turkey sat there, carved and waiting. The women stood frozen, caught between disbelief and terror. Some expected the food to be poisoned. Others thought it was a test, a cruel joke before something worse. Kimiko translated the guards' gestures for those who spoke no English, but even she could not explain this. She had been a signals operator in Manila, intercepting Allied transmissions, decoding American communications. She knew their military efficiency, their brutal island campaigns, their capacity for violence. She did not know they celebrated gratitude in the middle of a war. She did not know they would share that gratitude with prisoners who had worked to kill them. And in that moment, as her younger daughter whispered, "Mama, can we eat it?" Kimiko realized something more terrifying than any bomb. She had been lied to about everything. The women who stood in that mess hall doorway were not ordinary prisoners. They were radio operators who had decoded Allied transmissions across the Pacific. Nurses who had attended wounded Japanese soldiers in field hospitals from Singapore to Manila. Clerks who managed supply routes through conquered territories. Intelligence officers who analyzed reconnaissance photographs. When American forces swept through the Philippines in late 1943 and early 1944, these women were captured alongside combat troops. Military intelligence classified them as high-value detainees. They possessed technical knowledge, language skills, operational awareness. The War Department decided they would be brought to the continental United States, far from any potential rescue route, far from the war they had served. In July 1944, 45 Japanese women arrived at Camp Lordsburg, a sprawling internment facility in the high desert of southwestern New Mexico. The camp already held over 1,000 male prisoners, Japanese and Japanese American, in separate compounds surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Camp Lordsburg sprawled across 1,400 acres of scrubland, where temperatures reached 110 degrees in summer and dropped below freezing on winter nights. The facility had opened in 1942. Initially housing Italian and German prisoners before transitioning to exclusively Japanese detainees. By late 1944, it held military posts, civilian internees classified as security risks, and a handful of German prisoners still awaiting transfer. The women were housed in a separate barracks on the eastern edge of the compound, isolated from the male prisoners by 2 fences and 100 yards of open ground patrolled day and night. Army regulations prohibited fraternization between male and female detainees. The women lived under constant surveillance, counted 3 times daily, their letters censored, their movements restricted to a 30 by 40-yard exercise area and the barracks themselves. They slept on canvas cots. They washed clothes in cold water. They received the same rations as the men: beans, rice, bread, occasional tinned meat. The youngest among them was 17. The oldest was 52. Most were in their 20s and 30s, women who had volunteered for military service when Japan promised them equality, education, purpose. Kimiko Tanaka had two daughters, ages 8 and 10, who had been with her in the Philippines when she was captured. The Americans kept families together when possible, though regulations remained murky about children in military custody. Her daughters attended makeshift classes taught by other internees, learned mathematics on scraps of paper, practiced English in whispers. Kimiko told them nothing about her work during the war. She told them only to be polite, be quiet, survive. When guards came in mid-November and announced there would be a special meal on the fourth Thursday of the month, the women assumed it was a trick, or a test, or a prelude to something worse. Sergeant Robert Morrison had grown up on a farm in Iowa. He had 3 sisters. Before the war, he taught vocational agriculture at a high school in Cedar Rapids. He enlisted in 1942, trained at Fort Riley, and was assigned to Camp Lordsburg in 1943 as part of the Guard Detachment. By November 1944, he had been promoted to mess sergeant for the women's compound, responsible for food requisition, preparation, distribution. He read the memo from Camp Command 3 times before he believed it. The women would receive a traditional Thanksgiving meal identical in every respect to what the guards themselves would eat. No substitutions, no reductions. Full portions. The order came from Colonel James Harding, camp commandant, who would receive guidance from the War Department's prisoner of war division that adherence to Geneva Convention standards included recognizing American cultural observances for all detainees. Morrison requisitioned turkeys from a supplier in El Paso. He ordered sweet potatoes, cranberries, pumpkin. He pulled 2 of his best cooks from the main mess and set them to work 2 days before Thanksgiving. He did not know if the women would eat it. He did not know if they would understand it. He only knew the order was clear: treat prisoners with dignity. Even when the Pacific burned, even when American boys died on beaches with Japanese names. Morrison stayed awake the night before Thanksgiving, worrying the women would refuse the food, that they would see it as mockery, that the gesture would backfire into something uglier. He thought about his sisters back in Iowa, about his nieces who would be sitting down to their own Thanksgiving meal. He thought about how thin the line was between captive and captor, between enemy and human. He thought about what war did to that line, how it blurred and hardened and sometimes, impossibly, disappeared. The women lined up outside the mess hall at noon on November 23rd. The sun blazed white overhead. Dust devils spun across the empty yard. They wore the same gray cotton dresses issued to all female internees, shapeless and identical. Some had tied their hair back with strips of cloth. Others let it hang loose. The youngest children clung to their mother's legs, sensing tension without understanding it. The guards opened the doors. The women stepped inside and stopped. The tables had been arranged in a U shape. At the center sat a carved turkey flanked by bowls of mashed potatoes, dishes of green beans, baskets of rolls. There were peas, pumpkin, and apple pies cooling on a side table. Pitchers of water and coffee lined the serving counter. The guards stood along the walls, rifles slung, hands at their sides. Sergeant Morrison stood near the kitchen door, watching. No one spoke. The silence stretched, taut and fragile. Kimiko felt her daughter's hands trembling. She squeezed back twice, a signal they had developed over months of captivity. Be calm, be ready. The women glanced at one another, unsure whether to expect orders or a mistake. Colonel Harding stepped forward, tall, gray-haired, his uniform crisp despite the heat. Speaking slowly, he said, "Today's Thanksgiving. In America, we gather with family and give thanks. You are far from yours. You are prisoners. Yes. But today, you will eat as we eat." He gestured to the tables. After a long silence, Sergeant Morrison carved the turkey, filled a plate, and handed it to Sachiko Watanabe, who bowed instinctively. Guards followed, passing food down the line. Kimiko's daughter whispered, "Can we eat it, Mama?" "Yes," Kimiko said softly. Slowly, the first bites were cautious. The turkey was tender, seasoned with herbs, unfamiliar, but not unpleasant. The mashed potatoes were rich with butter. The cranberry sauce was tart, strange, almost sweet. Children who had known only rice and beans for months tasted pumpkin pie and could not name the flavor but ate it anyway, tears streaking their faces. Not from sadness, from the shock of kindness in a place built for confinement. The meal lasted an hour. Some women ate quickly, afraid it would be taken away. Others ate slowly, savoring every bite, memorizing the taste. Conversations began in low voices, Japanese mixing with broken English. One woman asked a guard what the orange vegetable was. "Sweet potato," he said, miming eating. She smiled, the first smile he had seen from any of the prisoners in 5 months. Another woman asked Kimiko to translate a question to Morrison. "Why this food? Why now?" Kimiko approached the sergeant, spoke quietly. Morrison wiped his hands on his apron. "It's Thanksgiving," he said. "We give thanks for what we have, even here, even now," Kimiko translated. The woman nodded, then bowed deeply. Morrison shifted uncomfortably, but nodded back. When the meal ended, the women filed out slowly. Some turned at the door and bowed again to the guards. The children waved. Kimiko's older daughter asked her mother if tomorrow would be the same. Kimiko said no, tomorrow would return to normal. The daughter asked why they were given this meal. Kimiko had no answer. She had been trained to intercept American communications, to decode their military strategies, to understand their tactics. She had not been trained to understand this. That night in the barracks, the women spoke in hushed tones about the food. The guards, the strangeness of their captors. They had been taught that Americans were brutal, that surrender meant torture, that prisoners were treated as less than animals. Yet they had been fed at a table set with care. One of the older women, a former intelligence officer named Mariko Ueda, said quietly that perhaps the propaganda had been lies on both sides. Perhaps there was something in this country that believed in rules, even for enemies. Perhaps the Americans themselves did not know how to reconcile their capacity for violence with their rituals of gratitude. The younger women wanted to believe her. The mothers held their children and said nothing. In war, hope was more dangerous than despair. December arrived cold and bright. The desert nights turned sharp. Frost appeared on the barbed wire at dawn. The women received thin blankets, 2 per person. They huddled together for warmth. The camp settled into winter routine. Shorter days, longer darkness, the war in Europe grinding towards some unseen conclusion. The Pacific theater still raging island by island. The women heard rumors from the male prisoners through shouted messages across the yard. Heard that American bombers were striking the Japanese home islands. Heard that surrender was still impossible, still unthinkable. Some women wept at night. Others prayed to distant gods. Kimiko wrote letters to her husband, unsure he lived or that her words would ever leave the camp. She told him the girls were safe, fed, learning English but not about Thanksgiving. How could she explain being fed like family by the enemy, or reconcile it with everything she believed about the war? On December 18th, Sergeant Morrison received another memo. Christmas dinner would mirror Thanksgiving full meal. Equal portions, cultural explanation. The order tightened his chest. A surprise had worked once, but repetition carried risks, expectations, resentment, and the burden of generosity during wartime. Morrison voiced his concerns to the colonel. Ardeen listened, then said simply, "We follow the rules. The rules say prisoners are treated with dignity. Dignity doesn't pause for inconvenience." Morrison requisitioned the supplies. Christmas preparations began in the camp kitchen on December 20th. Morrison's team baked bread, prepared glazed ham, made stuffing from scratch. They peeled potatoes, snapped beans, rolled dough for rolls. This time, they added decorations. Small paper snowflakes cut by children in the camp school hung from the mess hall rafters. They set candles on the tables, unlit for safety, but present. Morrison found a small fir tree from a supplier in Deming, set it near the entrance. strung it with popcorn made by the guards during their off hours. It was absurd and beautiful and fragile. It was everything the war was not. December 25, 1944. The women lined up again at noon, this time with less hesitation. Kimiko's daughters were excited, whispering about whether there would be more pie. The older women remained cautious but curious. The doors opened. The women entered. This time they did not freeze. They looked at the tree first, some pointing, some whispering translations to those who did not understand the custom. Then they saw the tables, the food, ham this time instead of turkey, but the same abundance, the same care. And this time, Sergeant Morrison did something unplanned, unrehearsed. He walked to the nearest table, picked up a small plate with a slice of pie, and brought it to Kimiko's younger daughter. He knelt down, smiled, and said, "Merry Christmas." The girl looked at her mother. Kimiko nodded. The girl took the pie with both hands, bowed, and whispered, "Thank you." Morrison's eyes reddened. He stood and returned to his post, not trusting himself to speak. The meal unfolded like Thanksgiving, but with subtle differences. The women served themselves this time, encouraged by the guards to take what they wanted. Some took seconds. The children asked questions about the tree, about the candles, about why Americans celebrated this day. Kimiko translated where she could, explained that it was a religious holiday, but also a time for family, for giving. One of the guards, Private Daniels, brought out a harmonica and played Silent Night quietly in the corner. Some of the women recognized the melody from Christian missionaries in Japan before the war. A few hummed along, tentative, their voices blending with the sound of the harmonica. With the clink of forks on plates, with the wind outside that carried no gunfire, no screams, only the cold desert silence. It was not forgiveness. It was not friendship. But it was a moment where the machinery of war paused, where the roles of prisoner and guard softened just enough to remember that beneath the uniforms and the barbed wire, everyone in that room was trying to survive the same madness. Everyone in that room had been told the other side was inhuman. Everyone in that room was wrong. After the meal, Colonel Harding stood and spoke again. This time, his words were shorter, more personal. He said that he did not know when the war would end, but he knew that how they treated each other in this place would matter long after the fighting stopped. He said that the women were prisoners because nations were at war, not because they were less than human. He said that he hoped they would remember this, and that when the war ended and it would end, they would carry the memory of this meal as proof that even enemies could choose grace. The women did not applaud, they did not cheer, but several stood and bowed deeply. Mariko Ueda, the older intelligence officer, approached Harding and spoke in careful English. "We will remember," Harding nodded. "So will we." The camp returned to routine. Decorations came down. Tables were stacked. Guards resumed patrols. Women resumed waiting. Winter deepened. Yet something had shifted, subtle but undeniable. The youngest children no longer flinched when guards passed. Some women greeted Morrison by name. Small conversations began, broken, limited, but human. One woman asked about Iowa. He told her about corn and pigs and fields that stretched to the horizon. She told him about rice fields in Kyoto, about mountains and temples, and a world that seemed impossibly distant. 3 minutes passed before the bell rang, signaling the end of recreation time. It was nothing. It was everything. By early 1945, news arrived in fragments. Germany was collapsing. Japan bombed daily. The women waited, fearful or numb. Kimiko focused on her daughter's teaching strength, kindness, and the idea that even behind wire and guns, small grace survived. Japan surrendered in August. Some women wept. Others simply exhaled. Repatriation crawled. Kimiko left Camp Lordsburg on November 12, 1945. At the gate, Sergeant Morrison handed her 3 small carved figures. She bowed. He stayed silent. In 1963, her daughter wrote to thank him. Morrison answered simply, hoping they'd found peace, never mentioning his nightmares or the single Christmas photograph he kept to remember that war didn't erase everything good. Camp Lordsburg closed in 1945. The barracks, fences, and towers vanished. Today, only a small marker remains, listing dates and numbers but saying nothing about Thanksgiving, Christmas, carved figures, harmonica music, or turkey in the desert air. It says nothing about the moment Kimiko Tanaka realized her enemy was more complicated than she'd been taught. Those wooden figures now sit in a small Tokyo museum, mostly unnoticed. But Kimiko's family remembers. They tell of war's contradictions, cruelty, and kindness side by side, and how. For one brief hour on 2 cold days, captor and captive simply acknowledged each other's humanity.